The iron wheels of the Union Pacific hammered against the tracks, a rhythmic, deafening percussion that had vibrated through the soles of Eleanor Pembroke's boots for 4 days. Outside the soot-stained glass, the landscape had ceased to be the polite, rolling greens of the East. It had opened its maw, swallowing civilization whole and spitting out an endless, tawny ocean of scrub brush, red dirt, and a sky so vast it made the chest ache to look at it. It was the year 1875. Nora sat stiffly on the hard bench seat, her spine not touching the backrest, a habit drilled into her by 3 decades of Boston etiquette that now seemed as useless as a lace fan in a hurricane. She smoothed the charcoal-colored wool of her traveling skirt. It was too heavy for the Texas heat that seeped through the wooden walls of the train car, but it was the most practical thing she owned. "I just know he is going to be a gentleman," the girl across from her chirped for the 3rd time that hour. Clara was 19, with corn silk hair and a mind as unburdened as a cloud. "Mr. Higgins wrote that he has a cabin with a wooden floor and 2 milk cows. Imagine, Nora, 2 cows." Nora managed a tight, polite smile. "That sounds very prosperous." "Clara." "And you, Nora?" Clara asked, her eyes wide and pitying. "Are you not excited to meet Mr. Brandt? A cattle rancher, that sounds dashing." Nora turned her gaze back to the horizon, where heat waves shimmered like ghosts. "Mr. Brandt is looking for a manager for his household and a mother for his future heirs," she said, her voice calm and devoid of romance. "And my father was looking for a way to settle a ledger. It is a transaction. Clara, nothing more." Clara fell silent, deflated by Nora's pragmatism, and turned back to her needlepoint. Nora did not mean to be cruel, but she had no energy left for illusions. She was 29 years old, in the drawing rooms of Beacon Hill. That number was a death sentence. She was a spinster, a woman with ink stains on her fingers from keeping her father's failing accounts, a woman who preferred the antiseptic smell of a hospital ward to the perfume of a ballroom. She was plain, she was opinionated, and she was expensive. Her father's voice still echoed in her head, louder than the train whistle. "I have no choice. Eleanor, the railroad speculation took everything. Mr. Whiteman says there is a rancher in Rio Santo willing to pay a handsome dowry for a woman of breeding and education. It clears the debt. Eleanor, it clears it all." So she had been packed up like a crate of dry goods. The contract in her reticule stated her duties clearly, but it said nothing of her heart. She was to be delivered to a man named Ezekiel Brandt in exchange for $500 sent back to Boston. She was a mail-order bride, though the term felt too hopeful. She was a mail-order spinster, sent west to be useful because she had failed to be decorative. The train lurched as it began a long, slow climb up an incline. The air in the car was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, tobacco smoke, and the underlying scent of fear masked by cheap lavender water. There were 12 women in the car, all heading to the end of the line, all running from something: poverty, scandal, or loneliness. Nora was running from the shame of being a burden. "Mind if I open the window a crack, ma'am?" Nora started. The man sitting diagonally across the aisle had leaned forward. He was older, perhaps 60, with skin the texture of a dried tobacco leaf and a white mustache that drooped over his lip. He wore a buckskin jacket that had seen better decades. "Please do," Nora said. "The air is stifling." He wrestled the sash up a few inches, and a blast of hot, dry air swirled into the car, carrying the scent of sage and dust. It was harsh, but it felt clean compared to the stagnant atmosphere inside. "Heading to Rio Santo?" the man asked. "Yes," Nora replied. "We all are." "Rough town," he said, leaning back and studying her with shrewd, watery blue eyes. "End of the track. Law is a suggestion out there, not a rule. We have been told it is civilized territory now." Clara piped up, looking alarmed. "The Indian wars are over?" The old man chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Wars change shape, little lady. They do not just end." He looked at Nora, seemingly dismissing Clara as too fragile for the truth. "You hear talk about the savages?" Nora nodded. "For days. The conductor and other passengers had whispered stories that made the blood run cold. Tales of scalpings, of burning wagons, of men buried up to their necks in ant hills. They say the Comanches are the devil on horseback, Nora said softly. Folks say a lot of things when they are scared. The man said. He pulled a plug of tobacco from his pocket but did not light it, merely holding it in his calloused hand. I traded horses with the Quahati band for 20 years. My name is Galloway. Eleanor Pembroke, she replied. And is it true? Are they monsters? Galloway looked out the window, his expression softening into something like respect. They are different. Miss Pembroke, they do not think like you or me. To them, this land is not something you own. It is something you breathe. They are cruel to their enemies. Yes, brutal. But I have never known a Comanche to break his word once he gave it. And they value courage above all else. A coward dies 1,000 times in their eyes. But a brave man or woman earns a seat by the fire. They are godless heathens. A woman 2 rows back snapped, clutching her Bible. Galloway shrugged. Maybe. Or maybe their God just lives in the wind and the grass instead of a book. All I know is, if you see a Comanche on a painted horse, you are looking at the finest light cavalry the world has ever seen. They fight because they are losing a world that was theirs for 1,000 years. Nora looked out the window again. The sun was beginning to dip low, setting the horizon on fire. The sky turned a violent, bruising purple, bleeding into a deep crimson. It was terrifying, yet strangely magnificent. In Boston, the sunset was blocked by brick buildings and church spires. Here, it consumed everything. For a moment, a strange sensation bloomed in Nora's chest. It was not happiness. Exactly. It was lighter than that. It was the absence of weight. Here, in this emptiness, nobody knew that she was the disappointing daughter of Arthur Pembroke. Nobody knew she was nearly 30 and unkissed. Nobody knew she was shelf-worn goods. The sheer scale of the land made her own problems feel small. And in that smallness, she found a sliver of freedom. She wondered what Ezekiel Brant was like. The letters written by a matchmaker. Not him said he was a man of substance with a thriving operation. She pictured a stern, older man with a ledger book of his own, checking off her arrival like a shipment of grain. I will do my duty, she promised herself. I will keep his house. I will balance his books. I will bear his children if God wills it. But I will not let him break me. Thirst scratched at the back of her throat. The water cooler was at the far end of the car, near the heavy sliding door that led to the baggage compartment. Nora stood up, her legs aching from days of sitting, and navigated the narrow aisle. The train swayed violently, forcing her to grip the seat backs to stay upright. As she reached the back of the car, the noise of the wheels was louder, a constant roar. The door to the baggage car was slightly ajar, latch broken, swinging with the motion of the train. Through the crack, thick cigar smoke drifted out, along with the sound of male voices. Nora filled a tin cup with tepid water, intending to drink and return to her seat. But then she heard a name. Brant. She froze, the cup halfway to her lips. Brant is a fool if he thinks he is getting prime stock for that price. A rough voice guffawed. He owes everyone from here to San Antonio. Nora stepped closer to the gap, pressing herself against the wooden paneling so she would not be seen. He owes the matchmaker, too, a second voice replied, deeper and slurred with whiskey. I heard him talking to the mayor when we loaded up in Abilene. Brant told Silas he does not have the $500. Not in cash. Nora's heart hammered against her ribs. If he did not have the money, her father would not be paid. The debt would remain. The sacrifice would be for nothing. So what happens to the woman? The first man asked. The Boston Spinster Brant ordered her special. That is the best part. The second man laughed. A wet, ugly sound. Mayor McGraw owed Silas. He says it does not matter. If Brant cannot pay the fee upon delivery, the contract is void. Silas says he will just put her up on the block with the others. The others? Silas has this idea. Says the town needs entertainment. Says bring all the women out to the square, an auction, public bidding. The highest bidder takes the bride. He reckons he can get more than $500 for a lot of them if he gets the miners and the cowboys drunk enough. The tin cup slipped from Nora's fingers. It hit the floor with a clang that should have been audible, but the roar of the train swallowed the sound. An auction? The first man wheezed with laughter. Like a cattle fair. Exactly like a cattle fair. Sent west for a fresh start. They said, sent west to be sold to the highest bidder. Says Brant is going to let it happen. He figures he can bid low on the Boston girl anyway because nobody else will want a woman that old who looks like a schoolmarm. He plans to buy her cheap, save the fee, and take her home anyway. And if someone outbids him, then she goes to the other fella. Brant does not care. He just wants a woman to cook and warm his bed. Any woman will do. Nora backed away, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The blood had drained from her face. She felt faint, not from the heat, but from a sudden, icy clarity. She was not a bride. She was not even a contractual obligation. She was inventory. She stumbled back down the aisle, her vision blurring. She passed Clara, who was humming a hymn and stitching a flower onto a handkerchief. She passed the woman with the Bible. She passed Mr. Galloway, who was dozing with his hat over his eyes. Nora collapsed into her seat, her hands trembling in her lap. She looked out the window again. The sun had vanished below the earth, leaving only a bruised purple bruise on the sky. The darkness was rising from the ground, swallowing the scrub brush, hiding the dangers that lay in wait. They were going to sell her, stand her up in a crate in the middle of a dusty town and sell her like a prize heifer. And the man she was supposed to marry, the man she had resigned herself to serve, was conspiring to humiliate her to save a few dollars. A cold, hard knot formed in the center of her stomach. It replaced the fear. It replaced the sadness. She looked at her reflection in the darkened glass. The face staring back was pale and tired, with dark circles under the eyes and hair pulled back too tightly. But the eyes were not the eyes of a victim. They were the eyes of Arthur Pembroke's daughter, who had balanced ledgers when grown men could not make the numbers add up. I am not cattle, she thought, the words ringing in her mind with the rhythm of the wheels. I am Eleanor Pembroke. She did not know how she would escape it. She did not know the laws of this wild place. But as the train hurled her toward Rio Santo and the inevitable humiliation awaiting her, Nora made a silent vow. She would not cry. She would not beg. And if they treated her like a savage, she would show them that a Boston spinster had a spine made of harder stuff than their cheap railroad iron. Outside, in the gathering dark, a coyote howled, a lonely, piercing sound that rose up to the first stars. It sounded like a warning, or perhaps a welcome. The train whistled, a long, mournful shriek, and began its final descent toward the borderlands, toward the Comanches, toward the auction block, toward a destiny that would shatter everything she knew and forge her into something entirely new. Nora sat up straight, lifting her chin. She watched the darkness rush by, and for the first time in her life, she did not look away. Rio Santo did not look like a place where hope went to thrive. It looked like a place where hope went to die of thirst. When Nora stepped off the train, the heat hit her like a physical blow, a solid wall of dust and grit that instantly coated her throat. The air smelled of unwashed bodies, horse manure, and the acrid tang of coal smoke. The platform was nothing more than rough-hewn planks warping under the relentless sun. And beyond it lay a town that seemed to have been slapped together in a hurry by men who cared for nothing but whiskey and silver. "Stay close," Nora whispered to Clara, who looked as though she might faint. The 12 women huddled together, a sea of drab wool and anxious faces against the backdrop of a raw, violent frontier. Men were already gathering. They lined the dirt street, leaning against the posts of the saloons, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. Their eyes were hungry. It was not the appreciative gaze of suitors. It was the assessing stare of butchers at a cattle fair. "Ladies, welcome to Rio Santo." The booming voice came from a man standing atop a crate near the station house. Silas McGraw was a large man, his girth straining the buttons of a checkered vest that had seen better days. His face was slick with sweat, and his smile was wide, showing teeth stained yellow by tobacco. He held a hat in one hand and gestured with the other as if he were the ringmaster of a grand circus. "I am Mayor McGraw," he announced, beaming. "And I represent the fine bachelors of this territory who have eagerly awaited your arrival." Nora tightened her grip on her valise. "Where is Mr. Brandt?" she asked, her voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. "My contract states I am to be met by Mr. Ezekiel Brandt." Mayor McGraw turned his gaze toward her. His eyes narrowed slightly as he took in her plain dress and the severe line of her mouth, but his smile did not waver. "All in good time, my dear. All in good time. But first, we must present you properly. The town has prepared a reception." Before Nora could protest, 2 deputies with tin stars pinned to their dusty shirts stepped forward, herding the women away from the station and toward the town square. It was not a gentle escort. It felt like a roundup. They were led to the center of the town, a patch of beaten earth dominated by a large, hastily constructed wooden platform. Above it hung a banner. The paint still fresh and dripping slightly in the heat, mail-order spinsters, sent west for a fresh start. Nora stopped dead in her tracks. The blood drained from her face, leaving her cold despite the oppressive heat. The conversation she had overheard on the train roared back into her mind. Public bidding. The highest bidder takes the bride. "Up you go, ladies," a deputy grunted, shoving a terrified Clara toward the steps. "This is improper," Nora snapped, turning to the mayor who was walking alongside them. "We have contracts, specific arrangements." McGraw chuckled. A wet, wheezing sound. "Contracts require payment upon delivery, ma'am, and money is tight in Rio Santo. Now, be a good sport. It is just a formality." They were forced onto the platform. The elevation made Nora feel dizzy, exposed to the hundreds of eyes staring up at them. Miners covered in coal dust. Cowboys with pistols strapped low on their hips. Drifters with empty eyes, they all jeered and whistled. "Look at the little one," someone shouted, pointing at Clara. "I will take the redhead," another yelled. Nora stood at the edge of the group, her spine rigid. She felt naked, stripped of her humanity. She was Eleanor Pembroke of Boston, a woman who could recite poetry and balance a ledger. Yet here she was, just flesh by the pound. At the front of the crowd, a man pushed his way through. He was tall and wiry, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and left out in the rain. His clothes were filthy, stiff with grease and dirt, and a long scar ran from his ear to his jaw. He stared up at the platform with a look of utter entitlement. "Brandt," the mayor acknowledged, nodding to him. "Glad you could make it. Ezekiel." "I want what I ordered." Ezekiel Brandt spat, his voice rough like grinding stones. "But I am not paying $500 for it. Not for that." He jerked a thumb toward Nora. Nora looked down at him. This was the man she was supposed to marry. This was the man of substance. He looked like a predator assessing a lame horse. "We will settle the price, Ezekiel," McGraw said soothingly, raising his hands to quiet the crowd. Gentlemen, settle down. Today is a day of celebration. We have brought civilization to Rio Santo." Laughter rippled through the mob. Just as McGraw opened his mouth to begin the proceedings, a different sound cut through the chaotic noise of the town. It was the rhythmic thud of hooves, not the erratic clatter of the town horses, but a synchronized, heavy thunder. The crowd parted instinctively, falling silent. Riding into the square were 6 riders. They were not white men. Their skin was the color of burnished copper, and they rode with a fluidity that made man and horse appear as one beast. They wore buckskin leggings and quiet confidence. "Comanche," a man near the front whispered, his hand drifting to his gun. "Hold it," the sheriff barked from the side. "They are under a flag of truce. Trading party. Let them be." The lead rider was young, perhaps 25 years old. He sat atop a paint horse with a coat of black and white splashes. His hair was long and dark, bound back from a face that was striking in its severity. High cheekbones and a strong jaw framed eyes that were dark and infinitely observant. He wore a simple cotton shirt tucked into leather trousers, a knife strapped to his thigh, and a rifle in a scabbard by his knee. This was Tahan. He halted his horse at the edge of the crowd, his gaze sweeping over the spectacle: the drunken men, the terrified women on the platform, the mayor sweating in his suit. His expression did not change, but there was a tightening around his eyes, a flicker of disdain. On the platform, Clara began to weep. Her hands shook so violently that her valise slipped from her grip. It tumbled off the edge of the platform and burst open in the dirt below, scattering lace undergarments and ribbons into the dust. The crowd erupted. "Look at those bloomers," Brant roared. Slapping his knee, McGraw shouted at Clara, "Pick it up or leave it. Stop blubbering, girl." Clara froze, paralyzed by humiliation. Nora did not think. She did not calculate. She simply moved. Ignoring the jeers, she knelt beside Clara and gripped the girl's shoulders. "Look at me," Nora commanded, her voice low and fierce. "Do not look at them. Look at me." She stood up and moved to the front of the platform, shielding Clara with her own body. She glared down at the men laughing at the spilled undergarments. She did not shrink. She did not cover her face. She looked straight at Ezekiel Brant, her eyes burning with a cold, blue fire. "Is this the hospitality of the West?" she asked, her voice projecting clearly over the laughter. "To mock a frightened child, you are not men, you are jackals." The laughter died down, replaced by an uneasy murmuring. They had expected tears, not a lecture. From his vantage point on the paint horse, Tahan watched. He saw the fear in the woman's hands, the way her knuckles were white as she gripped her skirt, but he also saw that she did not step back. He saw a woman who stood between the wolves and the lamb, armed with nothing but her dignity. "She has got a mouth on her," Brant sneered. Stepping closer to the platform, "Needs breaking." Mayor McGraw cleared his throat, sensing he was losing control of the show. Right. Let us begin. We have a fine selection today. Who will start the bidding for the young lady with the colorful luggage?" The auction began. It was a nightmare made real. Men shouted prices: $20, $50, 2 cows, a bag of silver. It was chaotic and degrading. Nora stood like a statue, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, but she refused to let them see her tremble. Finally, the mayor turned to Nora. "And here," McGraw said, his voice dripping with false pity, "we have Miss Pembroke. I'm from Boston. She is mature, educated, so she claims, good for keeping books and perhaps cooking a stew, though I cannot promise she will be warm in the winter." The crowd laughed again. "She is nearly 30 years old. Gentlemen," McGraw continued, "a bit long in the tooth, but sturdy. Do I hear $50? Silence. $20. Ezekiel Brant stepped forward. Hooking his thumbs into his belt, he looked up at Nora with a sneer that made her skin crawl. "I will give you $10. Brant announced loudly. "And that is charity. She is dried up, but I need someone to scrub the floors and keep the account straight. I will take her." $10, McGraw cried. "Do I hear 15? She is not worth the feed," someone shouted. $10 going once, McGraw said, lifting his gavel. Nora felt the world tilting. $10. Her life, her education, her dreams, all valued at the price of a cheap saddle. Brant was grinning, his eyes undressing her, promising a future of servitude and misery. She wanted to run. She wanted to scream, but there was nowhere to go. The desert surrounded them, and the law was the man selling her. "I will not cry," she told herself ferociously. "I will not let him see me break." $10 going twice. The Comanche do not sell women. The voice was not loud, but it carried the weight of iron. It cut through the heat and the dust, silencing the square instantly. Tahan nudged his horse forward, the crowd parting nervously to let the war pony pass. He stopped directly in front of the platform, ignoring the mayor and Brant, his dark eyes fixed solely on Nora. McGraw sputtered. "Now see here, this is town business. You Indians have your trading rights, but you do not interfere with— Interfere, Tahan interrupted. His English was accented but precise, learned from years of scouting for the very army that had hunted his people. I see a woman standing with honor, and I see men acting without it. Brant's face turned a violent shade of red. He put his hand on the grip of his revolver. You get back to the reservation. Redskin, this does not concern you. That woman is mine. Tahan did not look at Brant. He kept his gaze on Nora. Is she? Tahan asked calmly. Have you paid for her? Have you married her? I bid on her, Brant yelled. I am the only one who wants the old hag? Nora flinched at the insult, but Tahan's expression did not change. He looked at Nora, really looked at her, seeing the dust on her hem, the defiance in her jaw, and the terror in her eyes. He saw the way she had protected the younger girl. He saw a spirit that was being crushed by small men. Tahan turned his head slightly to address the crowd, though his words were meant for her. If you view her as a thing to be bought for $10, Tahan said, his voice ringing out, then you do not see what is there. You see a servant. I see a woman who stands tall when others cower. He looked back at Nora. I have no dollars. Mayor McGraw, I have no gold to throw in the dirt for your amusement. But the treaty says I may trade and I may conduct business in Rio Santo. You cannot buy a white woman, McGraw protested, wiping his forehead with a dirty handkerchief. I am not buying her, Tahan said coldly. I am offering a marriage, a contract, valid under your laws and mine. He extended a hand toward Nora, palm open. It was a calloused hand, strong and steady. If you go with him, Tahan said to Nora, nodding slightly toward Brant, you are property. He has bought you, and he will treat you as such. There is no law here that will stop him from doing what he wishes inside his own fence. Nora looked at Brant. The malice in his eyes confirmed Tahan's words. Brant did not want a wife. He wanted a slave he could legally abuse. If you come with me, Tahan continued, his voice dropping to a register that felt like a vibration in the air. You will be a wife. In my camp, a woman owns herself. I offer you my name. I offer you my protection. And I swear by the earth that I will not treat you as a purchase. The square was dead silent. The wind whistled through the gaps in the wooden buildings. This is ridiculous. Brant shouted, drawing his gun halfway out of the holster. She is a white woman. She is not going with a savage. The lady has a choice, Tahan said, his hand resting casually near his rifle, his eyes suddenly hard as flint. Unless you are saying she is a slave. McGraw saw the tension. He saw the 6 Comanche warriors behind Tahan, their hands hovering over their weapons. He saw Brant's stupidity about starting a massacre in his town square. And, in a twisted way, he saw a joke. Let her choose, McGraw shouted, a cruel smile returning to his face. Let us see. Go on. Miss Pembroke, will you scrub floors for Ezekiel Brant? Or will you go live in a teepee and eat dog stew? Then let the spinster decide. The crowd laughed again. Nervously this time, they thought it was a bluff. No white woman from Boston would choose a Comanche over a white man, no matter how vile the white man was. Nora looked at Tahan. He was a stranger. He was from a culture she had been told was terrifying. He was armed and dangerous. But he was the only man in this entire town who had looked her in the eye and spoken to her with respect. He was the only one offering her a choice, not a command. She looked at Brant, who was grinning like he had already won. She looked back at Tahan. His face was impassive, waiting. He would not beg. Nora took a breath. The hot, dusty air filled her lungs. She thought of her father selling her to pay a debt. She thought of the old maid whispers in Boston. She thought of the auction block. She took a step forward, toward the edge of the platform where the painted horse stood. Mr. Brant, she said, her voice trembling only slightly. You offered $10 for a servant. She turned to Tahan. This man offers me a name. She looked straight into Tahan's dark eyes. I accept, she said clearly. A gasp went through the crowd like a ripple of water. Brant's jaw dropped. You cannot be serious, Brant screamed. He is an Indian. He is a gentleman. Nora replied, the word landing like a slap. Which is more than I can say for you. McGraw, seeing the absurdity and the potential for a legendary story that would make people forget his cruelty, clapped his hands. Well, you heard the lady a wedding. We need the preacher get Reverend Miller. It happened in a blur. A terrified, bespectacled minister was shoved to the front. Tahan dismounted, his movement graceful and silent. He stood beside the platform and reached up. Nora placed her hand in his. His grip was warm and dry. Swallowing her smaller hand completely, he helped her down, not pulling, but supporting her weight until her boots hit the dust. Standing next to him, she realized how tall he was. He smelled of sage, leather, and wood smoke. He did not smell of whiskey. Do you, Tahan of the Quahadi, take this woman? The Reverend stammered, his Bible shaking in his hands. I take her, Tahan said, his voice deep and resonant. And do you, Eleanor Pembroke? Nora looked up at her husband. He was a stranger. She was terrified. But as she looked at him, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, an acknowledgement of the madness of the moment, and a silent promise of the protection he had offered. I do, she whispered. Then, by the power vested in me, and under the eyes of God, I pronounce you man and wife. Married her that day? A cowboy muttered in disbelief near the front. The spinster and the savage. Tahan did not wait for a kiss or a cheer. He turned to his horse, swung into the saddle in one fluid motion, and then reached down. Give me your hand, he told her. Nora reached up. He pulled her effortlessly onto the back of the horse. Behind him, she had to wrap her arms around his waist to steady herself. His muscles were hard beneath the thin cotton of his shirt. We are leaving, Tahan announced to the mayor. We have traded. The deal is done. He whistled sharply. The other warriors turned their horses as they wheeled around to leave the square. Brant spat on the ground. You will regret this, Nora. You will be crawling back to me in a week. Nora did not look back. She pressed her face against the back of the stranger who was now her husband. The horse surged forward, breaking into a gallop. They left the dust of Rio Santo behind, leaving the stunned crowd, the shouting mayor and the fuming rancher in their wake. They rode toward the open horizon, toward the river, and toward a life Nora could not yet imagine. She was no longer a mail-order spinster. She was the wife of a Comanche warrior, and she had just burned her only bridge back to the world she knew. The wind on the open plains did not blow. It scoured. It stripped away the stale air of the train car, the scent of coal smoke, and the lingering perfume of cheap lavender water. It replaced them with the smell of sagebrush, heated earth, and the musk of the animal beneath her. Nora clung to Tahan's waist, her fingers digging into the rough cotton of his shirt. She had never ridden a horse like this, without a side saddle, behind a man who moved with the animal rather than sitting upon it. Every stride of the painted horse sent a jolt through her spine, a physical reminder that she had left the paved streets of Boston far behind. She could feel the heat radiating from Tahan's back. It was a solid, living warmth. For a spinster who had spent her life in high-collared dresses, keeping a respectable distance from the opposite sex, the intimacy of the contact was shocking. She could feel the shift of his muscles as he guided the horse, the steady rhythm of his breathing against her cheek where she had pressed her face to shield it from the grit. They rode for 2 hours without stopping, putting miles of rolling prairie between themselves and the anger of Ezekiel Brant. When the pace finally slowed to a trot, the sun was dipping low, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and violet. Tahan did not speak. He seemed to be listening to the land, his head turning slightly at the cry of a hawk or the rustle of dry grass. Nora dared to lift her head. The landscape was terrifying in its vastness. There were no fences, no stone walls, no boundaries. It was a sea of grass that threatened to swallow her whole. What have I done? The question hit her with the force of a physical blow. She was Eleanor Pembroke. She was a member of the Congregational Church. She knew how to set a formal table and how to balance a double-entry ledger. And she was currently clinging to a Comanche warrior, a man her mother would have called a savage. riding toward a camp of people who had been at war with her government for decades. She had traded a life of servitude to a cruel white man for a life of... she did not know what. "We are here," Tahan said. His voice rumbled in his chest, vibrating against her. Nora looked up. Nestled in a valley near a broad, slow-moving river, the camp appeared like a mirage. Dozens of teepees made of buffalo hide stood in a rough circle, smoke curling lazily from their tops. Horses grazed in a large herd near the water, watched over by young boys. Dogs barked and ran to meet the returning riders. As they rode in, the camp went silent. Conversations stopped. Women looked up from their cooking fires. Men paused in their work on weapons or hides. Hundreds of dark eyes fixed on Nora. She felt the judgment instantly. It was different from the judgment in Boston, which had been veiled in polite whispers and pitying smiles. This was raw, open suspicion. She was the enemy. She was the white woman, the symbol of the soldiers who burned villages and the settlers who fenced off the hunting grounds. Tahan halted his horse in the center of the camp. He slid off with an easy grace and reached up for her. "Do not look down," he murmured in English, low enough that only she could hear. "Look at them. If you look at the ground, they will think you are ashamed." Nora swallowed the lump of fear in her throat. She gripped his hand and descended, her legs trembling from the long ride. When her boots hit the earth, she straightened her spine. She smoothed her dusty, wrinkled skirt and lifted her chin, channeling every ounce of Boston breeding she possessed. She met the gaze of an elderly woman standing near the entrance of the largest teepee. The woman had hair like gray iron wire and a face etched with deep lines of grief and survival. Tahan led Nora toward her. "This is Grey Willow," Tahan said formally. "She is the mother of my heart. My own mother died when the sickness came 10 years ago. Grey Willow took me in." He spoke to the old woman in their own tongue, a fluid, rhythmic language that sounded like water flowing over stones. Grey Willow listened, her face impassive. She looked at Nora, her eyes traveling from the dusty boots to the pale, sunburned face. She said something sharp to Tahan. Tahan did not flinch. He replied calmly, his tone respectful but firm. "What did she say?" Nora asked softly. "She asked if I have lost my mind." Tahan translated without a hint of embarrassment. "She says you are too old to learn to scrape hides, too skinny to bear strong sons, and you smell like lye soap." Nora blinked. The insult was so direct it was almost refreshing. "Tell her I'm excellent at mathematics," Nora said, her voice steady. "And I can sew a straight hem." Tahan's lips twitched, the ghost of a smile touching his mouth. He did not translate that. Instead, he turned to the gathered crowd, specifically addressing a group of young warriors who were leaning against a drying rack, smirking. One of them, a boy of perhaps 18 with an arrogant tilt to his head, called out something that made the others laugh. Tahan stiffened. He took a step toward the boy, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. The laughter died instantly. Tahan spoke a single sentence, his voice low and dangerous. The boy looked away, kicking at the dirt. "Come," Tahan said to Nora, his hand touching the small of her back. The touch was light, barely a graze, yet it sent a jolt of heat through her that had nothing to do with the sun. "We will go to my lodge." He led her to a teepee set slightly apart from the others. He pulled back the flap and gestured for her to enter. Inside, it was dim and smelled of wood smoke and sweetgrass. Buffalo robes were spread on the ground. A small fire burned in the center pit, casting dancing shadows on the sloping walls. It was intimate. It was a bedroom, a kitchen, and a living space, all forced into a circle 20 feet across. Nora stood near the entrance, clutching her reticule. The reality of her situation crashed down on her. She was married to this man, this stranger. In the eyes of the law, both his and hers, they were husband and wife. And night was falling. She watched as Tahan moved around the lodge. He placed his rifle near the door. He unbuckled his gun belt and laid it aside. Then he pulled his shirt over his head. Nora's breath hitched. He was beautiful. There was no other word for it. In Boston, men were hidden beneath layers of wool and starch. Tahan was carved from bronze and muscle. His chest was broad and scarred, evidence of a life lived in conflict. His arms were roped with sinew. The firelight caught the sheen of his skin, highlighting the power contained within his frame. He turned and caught her staring. Nora felt a blush heat her cheeks, hot enough to rival the campfire. She quickly averted her eyes to the ground. I do not know the customs," she stammered. "I do not know what is expected of me." Tahan watched her for a long moment. He saw the fear radiating off her, the way she held her bag like a shield. He remembered the auction block, the way Brent had looked at her like she was cattle to be broken. He moved to the pile of buffalo robes. He took one large, heavy fur and rolled it up. He placed it in the center of the sleeping area, creating a clear divider between two spaces. "This side is yours," Tahan said, pointing to the left. "That side is mine." Nora looked at the barrier, then up at him, confused. "We are married," Tahan said, his voice grave. "But I did not marry you to take you. I married you to keep you from being taken." He sat down on his side of the barrier, cross-legged, the firelight reflecting in his dark eyes. "You are a stranger here, Eleanor Pembroke. You are afraid. You think I am a savage because that is what your people teach." He paused. "I will not touch you. Not tonight, not tomorrow. I will not cross this blanket until you ask me to. And if you never ask, then I never will." Nora stared at him. The relief that washed over her was so profound her knees went weak. She sank down onto the soft furs on her side of the divide. "Thank you," she whispered. "Sleep," Tahan said, lying back and pillowing his head on his arms. "You are safe here. No one will enter this lodge without my permission. Not even the spirits." Nora lay down, still fully dressed in her corset and heavy skirt. She stared up at the smoke hole at the top of the teepee, where a single star was visible. She listened to the rhythm of his breathing. It was slow and steady. She was lying next to a Comanche warrior, separated only by a rolled-up fur. It should have been terrifying. But as she watched the firelight play across his sleeping profile, looking at the strong line of his jaw and the heavy sweep of his lashes, she did not feel terror. She felt a strange, humming tension in the pit of her stomach. It was a curiosity, a pull. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in days, she slept without dreaming of the auction block. The first week was a lesson in humility. Nora Pembroke, who could quote Shakespeare and calculate compound interest, was utterly useless on the southern plains. The next morning, she tried to help Grey Willow fetch water from the river. The water skins were made of buffalo bladders, slippery and unpleasant. Nora dropped hers twice, soaking her heavy wool skirt. The second time, she slipped in the mud and landed on her backside. A group of children, who had been watching her with wide eyes, burst into giggles. Nora sat in the mud, her dignity bruised. She expected Grey Willow to scold her. Instead, the old woman just shook her head, muttered something that sounded like "useless turtle," and handed the skin back to her. Later, she tried to help scrape a hide. The women used bone tools to remove the fat and flesh from the skin. It was grueling, smelly work. Nora's soft hands, used to holding pens and teacups, blistered within 30 minutes. She gagged at the smell of the raw meat in the heat. Tahan watched from a distance. He was working on a bridle, but his eyes followed her. He saw her struggle. He saw the frustration etched on her face, but he also saw that she did not quit. She wrapped her bleeding hands in strips of cloth and picked up the tool again. He felt a swell of pride in his chest that surprised him. She was not strong in the way of the Comanche, but she possessed a stubborn endurance that was its own kind of strength. One afternoon, 3 days after their arrival, Nora was sitting in the shade of the lodge, trying to mend a tear in her skirt. She saw an elderly man, one of the tribal elders named Runs with Deer, sitting with a trader who had come up from Mexico. They were arguing over a pile of metal axe heads and bags of coffee. Runs with Deer was holding up 5 fingers. The trader was shaking his head and holding up 3, pointing to a stack of beaver pelts. Nora watched, realizing the trader was confusing the old man with rapid-fire numbers. trying to shortchange him on the exchange rate of the pelts. She put down her needle and walked over. "Excuse me," Nora said. Both men looked up. The trader, a greasy man with a missing front tooth, sneered. "Get lost. Woman, men are talking business." Nora ignored him. She looked at the pile of goods. She looked at the pelts. "Runs with deer," she said, hoping she was pronouncing his name right. She pointed to the axe heads. "He is telling you that 3 pelts are worth 1 axe head, but yesterday the other trader gave 4 axe heads for 10 pelts. This man is cheating you by 20%. Runs. With Deer looked at her, then at the trader. He did not understand the words 20%, but he understood the tone of authority. Nora picked up a stick and smoothed a patch of dirt. "Look," she said. She quickly scratched out the numbers. "If you have 50 pelts," she did the division in the dirt, drawing clear lines. "You should receive 16 axes and 2 bags of coffee. He is offering you 12 axes. She looked up at the trader. "You are trying to take 4 axes and the coffee as profit. That is theft." The trader turned red. "Now listen here. You interfering little." Tahan stepped out from behind a lodge. He did not speak. He just stood there, arms crossed, watching the trader. The trader swallowed his words. He looked at the math in the dirt, then at Nora's defiant face, and finally at Tahan's imposing figure. "Fine," the trader grumbled. 16 axes, but I am out of coffee." "Then you owe him silver," Nora said instantly. $2. The deal was made. When the trader left, Runs with Deer looked at the dirt, then at Nora. He nodded, a slow, solemn gesture of respect. He said something to Tahan. "He says you have the spirit of a fox." Tahan translated, walking over to her. "And he asks if you can teach him to make the marks in the dirt." Nora smiled, a genuine, bright smile that transformed her plain face. "Tell him I would be honored." Tahan looked at her. The sun was behind her, catching the stray wisps of hair that had escaped her bun. Her face was dusted with the same red earth that covered him. She no longer looked like a guest. She looked like she was beginning to belong. "You did well," Tahan said softly. "I hate being useless," Nora admitted, wiping her dusty hands on her apron. "I cannot scrape a hide to save my life, Tahan, but I know numbers." "We have many hides," Tahan said, stepping closer. "But we have few people who can stop a thief with a stick in the dirt." He was standing very close now. The air between them seemed to charge with electricity. Nora looked up at his throat, at the pulse beating steadily there. She had an overwhelming urge to reach out and touch his arm, to feel the warmth of his skin again. Nora started, her voice breathless. "Tahan!" The shout broke the moment. A young boy ran up, holding a broken bow, demanding Tahan's attention. Tahan stepped back, the mask of the warrior sliding back into place, but his eyes lingered on Nora for a second longer than necessary before he turned away. That evening, Nora went down to the river alone. The heat of the day was fading, replaced by the cool, blue twilight of the plains. She found a secluded spot among the cottonwood trees where the water was shallow and clear. She knelt on the bank and dipped her hands into the water. It was cold and shocking. She splashed it on her face, scrubbing away the dust, the sweat, and the lingering feeling of being an outsider. She began to wash her other dress, the blue calico she had worn on the train. As she scrubbed the fabric against a smooth stone, she watched the dirt flow away downstream. It felt symbolic. The Boston Spinster, the woman who worried about tea services and the proper way to address a letter, was dissolving in this river. She unbuttoned the cuffs of her sleeves and rolled them up past her elbows. She unpinned her hair, letting it fall in a heavy wave down her back. It felt heavy and luxurious. In Boston, a woman never let her hair down outside her boudoir. Here, there was no one to scold her. She heard a twig snap. Nora spun around, clutching the wet dress to her chest. Tahan was standing by the trunk of a cottonwood tree, 10 feet away. He had come to water the horses. He stood frozen, staring at her. He had never seen her hair down. It was a rich, dark brown, thick and wavy. framing her face in a way that softened her sharp features. With her sleeves rolled up and her collar unbuttoned at the throat to catch the breeze, she looked raw and real. Nora did not cover herself. She did not scream. She stood her ground, breathing hard. Tahan took a step forward. The horses behind him dipped their heads to drink, ignoring the humans. "I did not mean to startle you," he said. His voice was rougher than usual. "You are quiet," Nora said. "Like a cat." "It is how I stay alive," he replied. He did not leave. He watched her, his eyes traveling from her bare forearms to her cascading hair. The desire in his gaze was not the hungry, grasping lust of the men in Rio Santo. It was a deep, appreciative heat. It made Nora feel beautiful. Not good for a spinster, but simply, purely beautiful. "Your hair," Tahan said. "It is like the earth after rain, dark and heavy." Nora felt her heart hammering against her ribs. "In my world, it is improper to see a woman like this." "We are not in your world." "Nora," Tahan said. He used her name. It sounded different on his tongue, softer, more intimate. "In my world, we do not hide what is good." He took another step. He was close enough now that she could smell the leather and smoke on him. He reached out a hand, hovering near a lock of wet hair that clung to her shoulder. "May I?" he asked. The consent was key. He was asking. Nora nodded, unable to speak. Tahan brushed the knuckle of his index finger against her cheek, catching the lock of hair. His skin was rough, calloused from war and work, but his touch was agonizingly gentle. He tucked the hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering on the sensitive skin of her neck. Nora leaned into his touch involuntarily. A shiver raced down her spine. She wanted him to wrap his arms around her. She wanted to know what that strength felt like when it was directed at her with affection rather than protection. "Tahan," she whispered. His thumb grazed her lower lip. His eyes darkened, the pupils blowing wide. He leaned in, his face inches from hers. Nora closed her eyes, her lips parting slightly. "Tahan." The shout came from the ridge above the riverbank. It was urgent, frantic. Tahan pulled back instantly, the warrior reflex overriding the lover. He spun around, his hand going to the knife at his belt. "Down here!" Tahan shouted back in Comanche. A rider appeared on the ridge, skidding his horse down the sandy embankment. It was Luis, the mestizo trader, but not the one who had tried to deceive the elder. This was a friend of the tribe, a man who moved news between the forts and the camps. His horse was lathered in sweat, blowing hard. Luis looked terrified. Tahan walked to him, grabbing the bridle to steady the horse. Nora hurriedly pinned up her hair and buttoned her collar, her heart still racing, but now from fear. Luis spoke in rapid Spanish, then switched to broken English when he saw Nora. "Bad news." "Tahan?" Luis gasped, wiping dust from his face. "Bad news from Rio Santo." "Speak," Tahan commanded. "Mayor McGraw. And Brandt." Luis stammered. "They went to the fort, to Colonel Mackenzie, and—" "They swore an oath," Luis said, looking at Nora with pity. "They told the colonel that the Comanche raided the town. They said you kidnapped a white woman, that you dragged Miss Pembroke away screaming." Nora stepped forward. "That is a lie. I went willingly." "It does not matter what is true," Luis said grimly. "It matters what is on the paper. They have sworn it. Brandt says you stole his property and violated the treaty." Tahan's face turned to stone. "And the soldiers? They are saddling up," Luis said. "A full company. They are coming to rescue her. And Brandt, he has gathered 20 men. He says he is coming to burn the camp to the ground." Tahan looked at Nora. The tenderness of the moment by the river was gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. "They want a war," Tahan said quietly. "They are using you as the excuse to break the treaty and take the land." Nora felt a cold chill settle in her stomach. She looked at the camp, at the smoke rising from the fires, where children were playing and old men were telling stories. Her presence here was no longer just a personal scandal. It was a death sentence for these people. "I have to go back," Nora said, her voice trembling. "If I tell them—" "No," Tahan said. He grabbed her shoulders, his grip hard. "If you go back, Brant will silence you. You will never speak to the colonel. You will disappear into Brant's ranch, and the army will burn this camp anyway." "Then what do we do?" Nora asked. Tahan looked toward the south, where the dust of the approaching army would soon be visible. "We fight," Tahan said, "but not with arrows. We fight with the truth, but first we must survive the storm." He turned to Luis. "Ride to the elders. Tell them to strike the tents. We will move tonight." As Tahan turned to run back toward the horses, Nora stood by the river. The water flowed on, indifferent to the chaos. She looked at her hands. They were no longer the soft hands of a Boston lady. They were the hands of a woman who had a choice to make to be the victim they painted her as, or the warrior's wife she had promised to be. She gathered her skirts and ran after him. The dust from Luis's arrival had barely settled when the weight of his news began to press down on the camp like a physical burden. The air grew heavy, not just with the heat of the afternoon, but with the suffocating tension of impending violence. Nora stood outside the council lodge, her hands twisting the fabric of her skirt. She watched as Tahan spoke with the elders. His face was grim, his movements sharp and agitated. Even without understanding the Comanche language, she understood the tone. They were discussing survival. They were discussing her. When Tahan finally emerged, he did not look at her. He walked straight to the edge of the camp, staring out at the horizon where the blue coats would come from. Nora followed him, though she kept a respectful distance. "It is my fault," she said softly. Tahan turned. His eyes were hard, but not with anger toward her. "It is the fault of men who want land that does not belong to them. You are just the excuse." "Nora." "But if I go back," Nora insisted, her voice rising with desperation. "If I surrender to them, tell them I made a mistake, perhaps they will leave the camp alone." "Do you believe that?" Tahan asked. "Do you believe Silas McGraw will let you speak? Do you believe Brant will let you walk away after you humiliated him?" He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. "If you go back, you disappear, and then the soldiers come anyway, because the lie has already been told." Nora looked down at her hands. They were trembling. "I am afraid, Tahan, I am afraid that because of me, children will die." "Fear is wisdom in the face of danger," he said. "But guilt is a stone around the neck. Do not carry it." That night, sleep was impossible. Nora lay on her side of the buffalo robe, listening to the wind pick up outside. It whistled through the gaps in the leather, a mournful, lonely sound. Unable to bear the confinement, she rose quietly and slipped out of the lodge. She walked to the riverbank, the same spot where Tahan had touched her hair. The water was black and glossy under the starlight. She sat on a piece of driftwood and let the tears come. They were hot and silent, born of frustration and a deep, aching loneliness. She was a woman between worlds, unwanted by one and a danger to the other. "Tears waste water," a voice said from the darkness. Tahan sat down beside her. He did not touch her, but his presence was solid and anchoring. "I used to scout for them," Tahan said suddenly. He was looking at the river, not at her. "For the army, 3 years ago? I thought if I showed them the trails, if I helped them find the renegades who broke the peace, they would respect the boundaries of the Quahadi." Nora wiped her face with her sleeve, surprised by the admission. "What happened?" "They used the trails I showed them to move cannons," Tahan said, his voice devoid of emotion, which made it all the more heartbreaking. "They surrounded a village of old men and women while the warriors were hunting. My village. I rode back to find ashes. I learned then that a piece of paper signed by a white chief in Washington means nothing if the man holding the gun does not know honor." He turned to her. "That is why I acted in the square. Nora, I saw you standing there, surrounded by men with no honor. I saw the same look in your eyes that I saw in the eyes of my people before the fire." Nora looked at him, really looked at him. seeing the scars that went deeper than the one on his face. "My father sold me," she whispered. "He did not burn a village, but he burned my life to pay for his mistakes. He looked at me and saw a ledger that needed balancing. He called me a burden, a spinster, useless." Tahan shifted, turning his body toward her. He was blind. The wind gusted, cold and sharp. Nora shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. Without a word, Tahan unclasped the heavy wool blanket he wore over his shoulders and draped it around her. He did not pull away. He stayed close, pulling the edges of the blanket so that they were cocooned together against the chill. They sat in silence for a long time, sharing warmth. Nora could smell the wood smoke in his hair and the scent of rain coming on the wind. She turned her head, finding his face inches from hers. His eyes dropped to her lips. The air between them crackled, a sudden, intense magnetic pull that made Nora's breath hitch. She saw the question in his gaze, the raw hunger he kept leashed behind his discipline. She wanted to lean forward. She wanted to taste the freedom he represented. His hand came up, his thumb grazing her jawline. It was rough, warm, and electrifying. "Nora," he breathed. But then he stopped. He pulled his hand back slightly, though he did not move away. "Not like this," he murmured, his voice strained. "Not because we are afraid of tomorrow. When I kiss you, Eleanor Pembroke, it will be because we have a future, not because we fear the end." Nora felt a rush of disappointment mingled with profound respect. He was right. To seek comfort in desperation was easy. To build trust was hard. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice shaking. The moment of quiet intimacy was shattered the next morning not by soldiers, but by the sky itself. The sun rose blood red, choked by a haze that turned the horizon a sickly yellow. The wind, which had been gusting all night, suddenly died. The silence that followed was heavy and ominous. "Get the children inside." Gray Willow shouted, her voice cracking like a whip. Nora looked up. To the north, a wall of darkness was consuming the sky. It was purple and black, roiling like a living thing. It stretched from the ground to the heavens, a dust storm of biblical proportions. "Sand!" Tahan yelled, grabbing Nora's arm. "Cover your face!" He shoved a piece of cloth into her hand and ran toward the horse herd, which was already spooking. The wall hit them with the force of a locomotive. Day turned to instant night. The air became a solid mass of grit that stung the skin like needles and filled the lungs with earth. Visibility dropped to inches. Nora tied the cloth over her nose and mouth, squinting against the stinging gale. She saw a small child, a girl of maybe 4, wandering confused near the edge of the camp, crying silently in the roar of the wind. Without thinking, Nora lunged forward. The wind nearly knocked her off her feet. She grabbed the child, shielding the little girl's face with her own body, and stumbled toward the nearest lodge. The sand bit into her skin, finding every gap in her clothing. She pushed the child inside into the arms of a terrified mother and turned back out. The goats. The pen had blown open. Nora saw Gray Willow trying to secure the gate, but the wind was too strong for her frail arms. Nora fought her way to the older woman. Together, they shoved the heavy wooden posts back into place, lashing them with rawhide strips as the sand whipped around them. For an hour, the world was nothing but noise and dirt. Nora worked blindly, helping where she could, her Boston upbringing forgotten in the primal need to survive. When the wind finally died down and the dust began to settle, the camp looked like it had been buried. Red dirt covered everything. Nora stood near the center fire pit, coughing. Her hair had come loose, a tangled mess of brown and red dust. Her face was streaked with dirt and sweat. Her dress was heavy with sand. Tahan walked toward her, leading his horse. He was just as filthy, his eyes the only clear things in a mask of dust. He looked at her ruined dress, her bleeding knuckles, and the way she stood firmly on the earth. He did not see a spinster. He did not see a white woman. "You look like the land," Tahan said, a grin cracking the dust on his face. Nora spat out a mouthful of grit. "I feel like I've eaten half of Texas." she replied dryly. Tahan laughed, a genuine, deep sound that made several of the other warriors look over in surprise. He reached out and brushed a clump of dirt from her shoulder. You are strong. Nora, stronger than you know. Luis, the mestizo trader, emerged from a lodge, shaking dust from his poncho. He walked over to them, reaching into his saddlebag. The storm bought us time, Luis said. The soldiers cannot track this, but they will come when the air clears. He pulled out a folded, crumpled piece of paper. I found this in Rio Santo. Tahan, before I left. It fell out of Mayor McGraw's pocket when he was drunk at the saloon. He handed the paper to Nora. She unfolded it, her eyes widening as she scanned the text. It was the original matchmaker's contract between her father and Ezekiel Brandt, but there were notes scribbled in the margins in Silas McGraw's handwriting. Clause 4. If the bride is rejected, the fee is forfeit to the mayor's office for processing. Note Brandt agrees to reject upon arrival. We split the $500. Put the woman to auction. No federal record. It is fraud, Nora said, her voice hard. It is federal mail fraud and conspiracy. They plan to reject me from the start to steal the dowry money and sell me. Is that useful? Tahan asked. Useful? Nora looked up, her eyes blazing. Tahan, this is a federal crime. If Colonel Mackenzie sees this, he cannot support Silas. It proves Silas is lying about everything, including the kidnapping. A man who falsifies a federal contract is a criminal, not a victim. The colonel is a white man, Tahan said skeptically. He will believe a white mayor over a piece of paper held by an Indian. Then a white woman will hand it to him, Nora declared. She looked at the elders who had gathered. I have to go to the fort. I have to show them this. It is a trap, one of the elders grunted. They will capture you. Not if we are fast, Tahan said. He looked at Nora, seeing the fire in her. He made a decision. I will take her. We leave now, while the dust is still in the air. Alone, Grey Willow asked fearfully. A war party attracts attention, Tahan replied. 2 riders can move like ghosts. 10 minutes later, they were mounted. They took only 1 horse to save strength for the others, choosing the strongest stallion. Tahan sat in the saddle. Nora sat behind him, her arms wrapped tightly around his waist. The journey was grueling. The heat returned with a vengeance as the sun climbed high. They rode through canyons and dry washes, staying off the main trails. The physical contact was constant and unavoidable. Nora could feel every shift of Tahan's body. She could feel the muscles of his back bunch and relax. She could smell the sweat and the leather. Her thighs ached from gripping the horse, and her chest was pressed against his back. It was exhausting, but it was also the safest she had ever felt. In the circle of his arms, or holding on to him, she felt an anchor. She rested her cheek against his shoulder blade, listening to the rhythm of his heart. Are you tired? Tahan asked, his voice vibrating through her. I am fine, Nora lied. We are close to the canyon pass. Tahan said, once we clear it, the fort is only an hour's ride. They entered a narrow gorge, where red rock walls rose hundreds of feet on either side. Shadows stretched long and cool across the sandy floor. It was quiet, too quiet. Tahan pulled on the reins, slowing the horse. His ears pricked up. What is it? Nora whispered. Birds, Tahan said softly. There are no birds. Crack. The sound of the rifle shot echoed off the canyon walls a split second before the bullet whizzed past Nora's ear. Hold on, Tahan shouted. He kicked the stallion into a gallop. Another shot rang out, kicking up dirt near the horse's hooves. There! Tahan pointed to a cluster of rocks high up on the ridge. A puff of smoke was dissipating. It is Brandt, Nora screamed, spotting the familiar black hat of the rancher. He brought hired guns, Tahan yelled. He leaned low over the horse's neck, making them a smaller target. A third shot cracked. Nora felt Tahan jerk violently. A hiss of pain escaped his teeth. Blood blossomed on his left shoulder, staining the white cotton of his shirt bright red. Tahan, I am fine, he gritted out. Keep your head down. They were running a gauntlet. Bullets slapped against the rocks around them. Nora buried her face in Tahan's back, squeezing her eyes shut, praying to a god she had not spoken to in years. She felt the heat of Tahan's blood soaking into her dress. "We have to get off the trail," Tahan shouted. He veered the horse sharply to the right, forcing the animal up a steep, rocky incline that led into a narrow fissure in the canyon wall. It was a suicidal climb, but the horse scrambled up, hooves striking sparks against the stone. They crested the ridge and plunged down into a dry creek bed on the other side, disappearing from the sight of the ambushers. Tahan kept riding, pushing the horse through the twisting maze of the ravine until the sounds of shouting men faded behind them. Only when the sun began to set, casting the ravine in deep purple shadow, did Tahan finally pull the horse to a halt. He slid off the saddle and stumbled. Nora was off in an instant, catching him before he fell. He was heavy, dead weight leaning against her. "You are hurt," she gasped, seeing the blood that had soaked the entire left side of his shirt. "Just a scratch," Tahan lied, his face pale beneath the tan. "Brant shoots like a blind woman." "Sit down," Nora commanded, her voice trembling but authoritative. "We cannot go further tonight. The horse is blown and you are bleeding." She helped him sit against the trunk of a twisted mesquite tree. The air was cooling rapidly, the desert night closing in. "I need to see the wound," Nora said. "Take off your shirt." Tahan looked at her. His eyes were glassy with pain, but the corner of his mouth quirked up. "Now you ask me to undress." "This is medical," Nora snapped, though her cheeks flushed. "Do not be difficult." With her help, he peeled the blood-soaked shirt over his head. Nora sucked in a breath. The bullet had furrowed a deep gash across his deltoid. It had not hit bone or artery, but it was ugly and bleeding freely. She tore a strip from her petticoat. The white cotton was cleaner than anything else they had. She used the water from their canteen to wash the wound. Tahan hissed as the water hit raw flesh, his muscles seizing under her hands. "I'm sorry," Nora whispered, her hands shaking as she dabbed at the blood. "I am sorry. Stop shaking," Tahan murmured. He reached out with his good hand and covered hers. His hand was hot, calloused, and engulfed her trembling fingers. "I have never seen a man shot before," Nora admitted, her voice small. "I have balanced books. Tahan, I have not stitched flesh." "You are doing well," he said softly. "Look at me." "Nora." She looked up. His chest was bare, rising and falling with shallow breaths. The firelight from the small fire she had managed to kindle danced across his skin, highlighting the ridges of muscle and the old scars of a warrior's life. He was vulnerable, and he was trusting her with his life. "You are not a spinster here," Tahan said, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. "You are the woman who rode through a storm. You are the woman who stood up to a gunman. You are my wife." The word hung in the air between them. "Wife." Nora finished binding the wound, tying the knot tight. She did not pull her hand away. She placed her palm flat against his chest, over his heart. She could feel it beating strong, rhythmic, alive. "If we die tomorrow," Nora whispered, "I want you to know, I do not regret getting off that train." Tahan looked at her with an intensity that made the rest of the world fade away. He leaned his head back against the tree, his eyes never leaving hers. "We will not die tomorrow," he promised. "But tonight. Tonight we are just a man and a woman under the stars." He shifted, making room for her on the blanket beside him. Nora hesitated only a second before settling against his uninjured side. He wrapped his good arm around her, pulling her close. She rested her head on his bare chest, listening to the night sounds of the canyon, feeling the heat of his skin seeping into hers. It was dangerous. They were hunted, but as she closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of him, Nora Pembroke knew she had never been more alive. Fort Richardson rose from the dusty plains like a jagged set of teeth, a sprawling complex of sandstone and timber that represented the only law for 200 miles. To Nora, exhausted and covered in the red dust of the canyon, it did not look like a sanctuary. It looked like the mouth of a trap. The sun was high and punishing as the stallion plodded toward the main gates. Tahan sat rigid in the saddle behind her, his left arm hanging uselessly at his side. The makeshift bandage she had applied in the ravine soaked through with fresh blood. He did not complain, but Nora could feel the heat radiating from him, the fever of infection battling the iron will of his endurance. "Halt!" The sentry on the wall shouted the command, leveling his rifle. Within seconds, the heavy wooden gates creaked open, and a squad of blue-coated cavalrymen rode out to intercept them, dust kicking up around their horses' hooves. "Identify yourselves," the lead sergeant barked, his hand hovering over his sidearm. His eyes flicked with hostility to Tahan, seeing only a Comanche warrior on a war pony, ignoring the blood and the white woman sitting in front of him. "I am Eleanor Pembroke," Nora announced, her voice raspy from thirst, but ringing with the imperious tone of a Boston schoolmistress. "And this is my husband. We are here to speak with Colonel Mackenzie. Immediately." The sergeant blinked, taken aback by the authority in her voice despite her tattered appearance. "The colonel is in a meeting, ma'am, with Mayor McGraw." Nora felt a jolt of cold fear, but she stiffened her spine. "Excellent. Then you can take us to him so I can call Silas McGraw a liar to his face." The ride through the fort parade grounds was a gauntlet of stairs. Soldiers stopped their drills to watch the strange pair, a Comanche warrior bleeding and stoic, and a white woman with wild hair and a dress ruined by sand and blood, holding her head high as if she were entering a ballroom. They were escorted to the headquarters building. The sergeant dismounted and signaled for them to follow. Tahan slid from the horse, stumbling slightly. Nora was there instantly, ducking under his good arm to support his weight. He leaned on her, heavy and solid, and together they walked up the wooden steps. Inside the colonel's office, the air was stagnant and smelled of cigar smoke and beeswax. Colonel Ranald Mackenzie sat behind a massive oak desk, looking every inch the weary commander. Sitting opposite him, holding a crystal tumbler of whiskey, was Silas McGraw. Ezekiel Brandt stood by the window, looking out, his silhouette tense and predatory. When the door opened, silence slammed into the room. McGraw choked on his drink. Brandt spun around, his hand twitching toward his hip before he remembered he was in a military office. "Good God," McGraw sputtered, standing up. "Colonel, look at the state of her, dragged through the wilderness by this savage." "Sit down, Silas," Colonel Mackenzie ordered, his voice calm but sharp. He stood, his eyes assessing Nora and Tahan with a calculating gaze. "Mrs. Pembroke. Or is it Miss Pembroke?" "It is Mrs. Yazzie," Nora said, using Tahan's tribal name. Her chin lifted. "Though I believe the mayor prefers to call me Lot Number 4. McGraw turned a shade of mottled purple. "She is hysterical. Colonel, the heat, the trauma." "Stockholm Syndrome, no doubt. We must separate them immediately. Sergeant, take the Indian to the stockade." "If you touch him," Nora said, her voice dropping to a lethal quietness, "I will scream so loud that every reporter in Texas will hear about it." Colonel Mackenzie raised a hand, halting the sergeant. "Nobody's going to the stockade yet. Mayor McGraw told me you were kidnapped from the train station, Miss Pembroke, that this man and his war party raided the town and carried you off. That is a lie," Nora stated flatly. Brandt stepped forward, his boots thudding heavily on the floorboards. "Now, listen here, Nora. We know you are scared. We know he threatened you, but you are safe now. You just tell the colonel the truth that he snatched you and forced you, and we will take care of the rest." His eyes bore into hers, a silent promise of violence if she disobeyed. Nora looked at Ezekiel Brandt. She saw the man who had tried to buy her for $10. She saw the man who had shot her husband from a ridge like a coward. "I am telling the truth," Nora said, reaching into the bodice of her dress. She pulled out the crumpled, stained piece of paper Luis had given them. She walked to the desk and slammed it down in front of the colonel. "This is the contract my father signed with Mr. Brandt." She pointed a shaking finger at the margins. "And those are Mayor McGraw's handwriting. Clause 4, conspiracy to commit fraud, conspiracy to traffic a human being across state lines." The colonel picked up the paper. He adjusted his spectacles and read in silence. McGraw shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to the door. This is a forgery," McGraw stammered. "Just paper trash found in a teepee." "I found it in your pocket. Silas." A voice came from the doorway. Everyone turned. Standing there was Father Donovan, the elderly Catholic priest from the Rio Santo mission. He held a hat in his hands, his face sorrowful but determined. "Father," the colonel asked. "I was in the saloon 3 nights ago. Colonel," the priest said softly, "I heard the mayor boasting. He told Mr. Brandt that the Spinster auction would bring in more money than the matchmaker's fee. He laughed about it. He said no one would care about a woman past her prime." McGraw collapsed into his chair, the fight draining out of him. Nora turned back to the colonel. "I was not kidnapped. I was rejected. I was humiliated. I was put on a block in the town square to be sold to the highest bidder like a heifer at a county fair." She took a breath, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. "The only man who treated me with dignity that day was Tahan. He did not buy me. He offered me marriage to save me from the slavery these men planned for me." "It is a disgrace," Brandt roared, unable to contain himself. "A white woman with a Comanche. It is against nature. It is humiliating for you. Nora, we are trying to save your soul." Humiliation. Nora spun on him, her eyes blazing. "You speak to me of humiliation. Humiliation is being rapped on the teeth like a horse to check for rot. Humiliation is standing in the dust while men jeer at your age and your weight. That is what you offered me. Ezekiel Brandt." She stepped closer to him, forcing him to look down at her. "I chose him," she hissed. "I chose honor, something you know nothing about." Colonel Mackenzie looked at Tahan, who had remained silent by the door, leaning heavily against the frame, his blood dripping onto the floor. "And you," the colonel said to the warrior, "you know the treaty forbids Comanches from entering the town armed." Tahan lifted his head. His face was gray with pain, but his eyes were clear. "The treaty says we may trade," Tahan rasped, his voice dry. "The treaty says if we keep the peace, the army will protect our rights. I went to trade horses. I saw a crime. I stopped it." He looked at the colonel, man to man. "Your paper says you are men of law. If you punish me for saving a woman from thieves, then your law is no better than the wind." The room fell silent. Colonel Mackenzie looked from the contract to the priest, then to the terrified mayor, and finally to the defiant woman and the wounded warrior. "Sergeant," Mackenzie said quietly. "Sir, escort Mayor McGraw to the holding cell. I want a federal marshal wired in Dallas immediately regarding charges of mail fraud and conspiracy." "Now see here," Ranald, McGraw shouted, standing up. "You cannot do this. I am the mayor. You are a crook." "Silas," Mackenzie said coldly. "Get him out." 2 soldiers grabbed McGraw and dragged him, protesting, from the room. The colonel turned to Brandt. "As for you, Mr. Brandt, I cannot arrest you for being a bore, but I am declaring the contract void based on fraud. Mrs. Yazzie is free to go. And if you or your men go near the Comanche camp, I will consider it an act of insurrection against the United States Army." Brandt's face twisted into a mask of pure hatred. He looked at Nora, then at Tahan. "This is not over," he snarled. "You think a piece of paper stops me. This is my land, my law." He stormed out of the office, his spurs jingling aggressively. "Colonel," Nora said, her knees shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. "My husband needs a doctor. He was shot." "By whom?" Mackenzie asked sharply. "By Ezekiel Brandt," Nora said. "In the canyon. Yesterday." Mackenzie swore softly. "Dr. Reynolds," he bellowed. "Get in here." An hour later, Tahan's wound was cleaned and stitched. The army doctor, a gruff man with cold hands, had shaken his head at the damage but declared that the warrior was as tough as old leather and would survive. They were allowed to leave. The colonel advised them to stay at the fort for safety, but Tahan refused. He would not sleep inside the walls of the men who had burned his village. Nora understood. They walked out of the main gates, Tahan moving stiffly, his arm in a sling. Their horse had been watered and fed by a sympathetic stable boy. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the scrubland outside the fort walls. The air was cooling, but the tension remained. "We should ride fast," Tahan murmured as they approached the horse. "Brant is not a man who walks away." "He has no men," Nora said. "The colonel said—" "Brant does not care what the colonel said." They reached the hitching post. Tahan reached for the saddle horn. "Indian lover." The shout came from the shadow of a supply wagon parked 50 yards away. Ezekiel Brant stepped out. He was not alone. 3 of his ranch hands were with him, looking nervous but weapons drawn. Brant held a heavy buffalo rifle. "I told you it was not over," Brant yelled, his voice slurring slightly. He had been drinking. "You think you can humiliate me in front of the colonel and just ride off into the sunset with him?" "Put the gun down, Ezekiel!" Nora shouted, stepping away from the horse. "The colonel will hear the shot." "Let him hear," Brant laughed wildly. "I will tell him the savage attacked me. It is my word against a dead Indian and a crazy woman." He raised the rifle, aiming squarely at Tahan's chest. Time seemed to slow down. Nora saw the madness in Brant's eyes. She saw the hesitation in the ranch hands. She saw Tahan, weakened by blood loss and unarmed except for the knife at his belt, trying to shove her behind him. "Run, Nora!" Tahan shouted. Brant's finger tightened on the trigger. Tahan lunged, not away from the gun, but toward Nora. He threw his body across hers, shielding her. Boom! The rifle shot was deafening. Tahan jerked violently, a grunt of pain escaping his lips as the heavy slug slammed into his right forearm, spinning him around and knocking him to the ground. "No!" Nora screamed. Tahan lay in the dust, groaning. His good arm, his only good arm, was shattered. He was defenseless. Brant racked the lever of his rifle, ejecting the spent shell. He was grinning. He walked forward slowly, savoring the kill. "Now," Brant sneered, "I am going to finish this vermin, and then I am going to take you back to the ranch and teach you some manners." "Nora." The ranch hands watched, paralyzed. They were hired to herd cattle, not witness murder, but fear held them still. Nora looked at Tahan. He was trying to rise, his eyes unfocused, blood pooling under him. He looked at her, and she saw an apology in his eyes. He had promised to protect her, and he was failing. Something broke inside Nora Pembroke. The fear that had defined her life, the fear of her father, the fear of poverty, the fear of judgment, the fear of violence, evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, white-hot clarity. She saw the pistol that had fallen from Tahan's belt when he fell. It was a heavy army Colt. She did not think. She did not hesitate. She dove into the dust. "Hey!" Brant shouted. Nora's hand closed around the cold steel of the grip. It was heavy, heavier than she expected. She rolled onto her knees, bringing the gun up with both hands. She did not close her eyes. She did not look away. She looked directly at Ezekiel Brant. "Back off!" she screamed, the sound tearing from her throat. Brant stopped, blinking. He laughed. You are going to shoot me! Spinster, you do not even know how to cook it." Nora's thumb found the hammer, with a strength she did not know she possessed. She pulled it back until it clicked. The sound was loud in the sudden silence. "I said back off." "Ezekiel," Nora's voice was not shaking anymore. It was steel. "I am not your property. I am not your inventory. And if you take one more step, I will put a hole in you the size of a silver dollar." Brant's smile faltered. He looked at the gun. The muzzle was wavering slightly, but at this range, she could not miss. "You are crazy," Brant whispered. "You are a crazy witch." "I am a wife defending her husband," Nora said. "Drop the rifle." "You will not shoot," Brant challenged, though he did not move forward. "You are a Boston lady. You do not have the guts." "Try me," Nora whispered. Her finger tightened on the trigger. She felt the tension of the spring. She was ready. She would kill him. She knew it with absolute certainty. She would kill him to save the man bleeding in the dirt behind her. "Drop it!" The shout came from the gate. Colonel Mackenzie and a dozen soldiers came running, rifles raised. "Drop the weapon, Brant!" Mackenzie roared. "Or my men will cut you down where you stand." Brant looked at the soldiers. He looked at Nora. Seeing the lethal intent in her blue eyes, he realized, perhaps for the first time, that he had lost. He let the rifle fall to the dust. "Arrest him!" Mackenzie barked. "And the others!" Soldiers swarmed forward, tackling Brant and his men. Nora did not lower the gun. She stayed on her knees, aiming at Brant until he was shackled and dragged away. Only then did her fingers loosen. The Colt fell from her hands into the dust. She scrambled backward, turning to Tahan. "Tahan!" she choked out. He was conscious, but barely. His face was ashen. He looked at her with awe. "You," he whispered, his voice already. "You held the gun." "I told you," Nora sobbed, pressing her hands against his new wound to staunch the flow. "I told you I do not regret it." She looked down at her dress. It was ruined, stained with mud, horsehair, and the blood of the man she loved. Her hands were filthy. She had nearly killed a man. She should have been horrified. She should have been fainting. But she felt fierce. She leaned down, brushing the hair from Tahan's damp forehead. Soldiers were running toward them with a stretcher, but Nora only saw him. "I am not going back to Boston," she whispered fiercely, her tears falling onto his face. "I am not going anywhere. My home is where you stand. Tahan, even if you are lying in the dirt, that is my home." Tahan reached up with a trembling hand, his fingers brushing her cheek. "Then we are home," he breathed. And as the darkness of unconsciousness took him, he was smiling. The dust of the parade ground settled, but the tremors of the confrontation at Fort Richardson rippled outward, shaking the foundations of Rio Santo. The law, which had been absent for so long, had finally arrived not in the form of a gun, but in the form of a federal inquiry. Colonel Mackenzie sat behind his desk, the exhaustion of the last 48 hours etched into the lines around his eyes. Across from him sat Silas McGraw, no longer the preening mayor in a checkered vest, but a deflated man in handcuffs. "You cannot do this, Ranald," McGraw whined, wiping sweat from his upper lip with his sleeve. "I am an elected official. I was cleaning up the streets. Those women were a burden on the territory." "You were trafficking human beings, Silas," Colonel Mackenzie said, his voice devoid of sympathy. "I have wired the marshal in Dallas. He is very interested in your ledger books. It seems Miss Pembroke's contract was not the only one you altered. There are 12 other women in this territory whose dowries seem to have vanished into your civic improvement fund." McGraw blustered, but the fight had gone out of him. As the soldiers escorted him out of the headquarters and toward the wagon that would take him to the federal district court, the town of Rio Santo watched. Men who had once tipped their hats to him now spat in the dirt as he passed. The illusion of his power had been shattered by a spinster with a contract and a colonel with a conscience. The whispers began before the wagon even left the gates, murmurs that perhaps they had let a snake sleep in their bed for too long. Ezekiel Brant fared little better. He stood before the colonel's desk, his wrist shackled to a chair, his face a mask of sullen fury. "I want my lawyer," Brant growled. "You will get one," Mackenzie replied, stacking papers. "But do not expect him to save your grazing rights. You fired a weapon at a woman and a man under the protection of the United States Army. You attempted murder in front of a dozen witnesses." "He is an Indian," Brant spat. "He is a man protected by a treaty you just violated." Mackenzie retorted sharply. "I cannot hang you, Brant, as much as I might like to. The courts are slow, and you have money for lawyers who will argue self-defense. But I can hit you where it hurts." The colonel picked up a map of the territory. He took a pen and drew a thick, black line across the southern quadrant of Brant's ranch. "This land borders the reservation," Mackenzie said. "As of this morning, it is a military buffer zone. You are banned from grazing cattle within 10 miles of the Quahati camp. If I see one of your steers on that grass, I will confiscate the entire herd. If I see you or your men near the river, I will arrest you for insurrection." Brant turned pale. Losing the river access and the southern grazing lands was a financial death sentence. It would cripple his operation. He would not starve, but he would no longer be the king of Rio Santo. He would be just another rancher with too many cows and not enough water. "You are ruining me for a savage," Brant hissed. "I am penalizing you for being a fool," Mackenzie said, not looking up. "Get him out of my sight." While the white world tied itself in legal knots, the world of the Quahati was quiet. The journey back to the camp had been slow. Tahan, weakened by blood loss and the shock of the bullet shattering his arm, had drifted in and out of consciousness. Nora had ridden behind him, holding him upright, her arms wrapped around his waist so tightly that her muscles ached for days afterward. When they finally crested the ridge and saw the circle of teepees, Nora felt a sensation she had never expected to feel in this wild place. She felt like she was coming home. They were met with cautious relief. Grey Willow took one look at Tahan's hanging arm and barked orders to the younger women. He was carried into the lodge, laid upon the buffalo robes, and the work of healing began. This was where the two worlds truly met. Grey Willow brought a poultice made of prickly pear cactus and sage, swearing by its power to draw out the bad spirits of the infection. Nora, summoning her training from the charity wards in Boston, insisted on boiling the water before washing the wound and using clean linen strips she tore from her own petticoats rather than the cured leather thongs the Comanche used. There was a moment of tension. Grey Willow held the green, pungent mash of cactus. Nora held the steaming bowl of water. They looked at each other across Tahan's feverish body. "The spirit must be cleaned," Grey Willow signed, her face stern. "The flesh must be clean," Nora replied in English, miming the action of washing. Tahan, his eyes half open, let out a dry, pained chuckle. "Use both," he rasped. "If I die. I do not want two women arguing over my ghost." So they compromised. Nora cleaned the wound with the meticulous, stinging precision of a nurse, removing every speck of dust and gunpowder. Then, she stepped back and allowed Grey Willow to apply the cooling cactus mash to reduce the swelling. For 3 days and 3 nights, the fever raged. Tahan tossed on the furs, muttering in Comanche, sometimes shouting warnings about soldiers and cannons. Nora did not leave his side. She bathed his forehead with cool river water. She held his good hand when he thrashed. She sang low, quiet hymns from the hymnals she had memorized, the soft melodies of New England mingling with the rhythmic chants of the medicine man who sat outside the lodge. On the 4th morning, the fever broke. Nora was dozing sitting up, her head resting on her knees, when she felt a touch on her arm. She jerked awake. Tahan was looking at her. His eyes were clear, the glassy sheen of infection gone. He looked exhausted, his face gaunt, but he was present. "You are still here," he whispered. His voice was rough, like gravel. "Where else would I be?" Nora asked, reaching for the water skin. She lifted his head gently to help him drink. "I dreamt you went back," Tahan said, water trickling down his chin. "I dreamt the train came and took you away." Nora wiped his chin with her thumb. "The train is gone, Tahan, and I let it go." Later that day, the elders came. Runs with Deer and 2 other old men sat outside the lodge, smoking their pipes. They asked to speak with Tahan. Nora stepped outside to give them privacy, but she stayed close enough to the entrance to hear the murmur of voices. She busied herself with grinding corn in a stone bowl. A task she had learned was agonizingly slow. After a long time, the elders left. Tahan called for her. She entered the lodge. He was propped up against a backrest made of willow branches. He looked troubled. "What did they say?" Nora asked, sitting beside him. "They are worried," Tahan admitted. He looked at his bandaged arm, then at her. "They say the white men have punished their own kind, the mayor and the rancher. They say the justice of the white man is satisfied. Now they ask, if the danger is gone, will the white bird fly back to her own nest?" Nora stopped grinding the corn. She looked at her hands. They were stained with red dust and yellow cornmeal. Her fingernails were broken. Her skin was browning in the sun. "They think I only stayed because I was afraid of Brant," she said softly. "They think you stayed because you had no choice." Tahan corrected. "Now you have a choice. You could go to the fort. The colonel would give you a ticket to Boston. You could be Eleanor Pembroke again." Nora looked around the lodge. She looked at the fire pit she had learned to bank so it would last the night. She looked at the drying herbs hanging from the poles. She looked at the man who had taken a bullet for her. "Eleanor Pembroke was a ghost," she said firmly. "She lived in a house where she was not wanted, doing work that did not matter. Here, I am real." She stood up and dusted off her skirt. "I will not speak to the elders," she decided. "Words are wind. I will show them." And she did. Over the next 2 weeks, Nora did not act like a guest. She acted like a woman of the camp. When the hunters returned with a kill, she was there with the other women, knife in hand. She was slow, and her cuts were not as clean as gray willows, but she did not flinch at the blood. She hauled water until her shoulders burned. She gathered wood. She saw the doubt in the eyes of the people slowly turn to grudging respect. She was not Comanche. She would never be fully Comanche. She walked too heavy and talked too much. But she was useful. And more importantly, she was loyal. One evening, a fortnight after the shooting, the air turned crisp with the promise of autumn. Tahan was strong enough to sit by the fire for long stretches. His arm was healing well, though the scar would be ugly and deep. They sat together in the lodge. The flap closed against the chill. The fire popped and hissed, casting a golden glow over the small space that had become their entire world. Nora was mending a shirt, Tahan's shirt, the one the bullet had torn. Tahan was watching her, his dark eyes tracing the line of her profile. "You sew like a soldier," he observed, amused. "Tight stitches, practical, no beauty." "It will hold," Nora retorted, biting off the thread. "That is what matters. Beauty does not stop the wind." She put the shirt down and looked at him. Her eyes fell on his bare shoulder, where the fresh, pink scar tissue stood out against his copper skin. Without thinking, she reached out. He did not pull away. Her fingertips grazed the jagged line of the wound. It was warm. It was a map of violence written on his body, a story of the day he had chosen her over his own life. "Does it hurt?" she asked softly. "Only when it rains." Tahan lied. He captured her hand, pressing her palm against his chest, right over his heart. "It reminds me that I'm alive. And why am I alive?" The mood in the lodge shifted. It deepened. The easy banter of the last few weeks fell away, revealing the current of attraction that had been running beneath the surface since that first night on the train. "We have to talk about what comes next," Tahan said, his voice dropping to a low rumble. "The grazing ban on Brant has changed things. The soldiers are keeping their distance. We have peace, for now." "Peace is good," Nora whispered. "It is," Tahan agreed. "But we cannot live on air. I can no longer hunt as I did not with this arm. Not for a long time. And you have a mind for numbers that are wasted on scraping hides." He stroked the inside of her wrist with his thumb, sending shivers racing up her arm. "I have been thinking," Tahan continued. "The treaty allows for a trading post, a legal one, not like the cheats who come here, a place where my people can bring their furs and horses and get fair goods in return. Real axes, good flour, no whiskey." Nora's eyes widened. "A trading post. You know the white man's money." Tahan said, "You know their contracts. You know how to read their papers so they cannot steal from us. And I know the people. I know the land." "A partnership," Nora said, the accountant in her sparking to life. "We could set it up near the river crossing. It is technically reservation land, so no taxes to the county, but close enough to the road for wagons." Tahan smiled. It was a slow, devastating smile that made Nora forget about tax codes. "A partnership," he agreed. He pulled her closer. The distance between them on the buffalo robes vanished. "In all things," Nora looked at him. For weeks, the rolled-up fur had been a wall between them, a symbol of his honor and her fear, but the fear was gone. "Tahan," she said, her voice trembling slightly, not from terror, but from anticipation. "The wall. We do not need the wall tonight." Tahan went still. He searched her face, looking for any sign of hesitation. He found only open, honest desire. "Are you sure, Nora?" he asked. "Once this line is crossed, there is no going back. You are tied to me, to this life." "I burned the return ticket," Nora whispered. She leaned forward, closing the final inches between them. "I am exactly where I want to be." He kissed her. It was not the tentative, stolen moment by the river. It was a claim. His mouth was hot and firm, tasting of wood smoke and desire. Nora made a small sound in her throat and wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her hands in his long, dark hair. The kiss deepened, urgent and hungry. Tahan groaned low in his throat, shifting so that he was leaning over her, mindful of his injured arm, but pressing her back into the soft furs. The weight of him was heavy and wonderful. It grounded her. There was no shame. There was no awkwardness. There was only the firelight, the smell of sage, and the realization that two lonely people had found their match in the most unlikely of places. As Tahan's hand moved to undo the buttons of her Boston bodice buttons she had fastened every morning for 30 years, Nora helped him. The fire burned low, the shadows lengthened, and the world outside the lodge ceased to exist. The next morning, the sun rose over the plains with a brilliance that hurt the eyes. Nora emerged from the lodge first. She carried the water skin, heading for the river. The women at the cooking fires looked up. They saw something different. Nora was wearing her white cotton shirt from Boston, the one with the high collar, though the top button was undone. But her heavy woolen skirt was gone, replaced by a skirt of soft, cured buckskin that Gray Willow had made for her. And her hair, her long, brown hair, was no longer pinned up in a severe bun. It was braided into two thick plaits, wrapped with strips of otter fur, in the style of a Comanche matron. She was neither fully white nor fully Comanche. She was something new, a bridge. She walked to the river, filled the skin, and splashed water on her face. She felt light. The burden of being the spinster was gone. She was a wife. She was a partner. She was loved. When she returned to the camp, she found Luis, the mestizo trader, watering his mule. He grinned when he saw her. "Morning, Mrs. Yazzie," he called out cheerfully. "Good morning." "Luis," Nora replied. "What news from the world?" "Good news," Luis said, accepting a cup of coffee. "The colonel issued a general order. No more mail-order deliveries to the territory without a magistrate present to verify the contract. He called it the Pembroke Rule. Stopped a shipment of ladies in Abilene yesterday." Nora smiled. "That is good. And the others? The women on the train with me?" "Most scattered," Luis said. "But the little one, Clara, she refused to marry the farmer she was sent to. Cited the new rule. She is working in the bakery in Fort Worth now. Doing just fine." Nora felt a warmth bloom in her chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. She had not just saved herself. She had kicked a stone that started an avalanche. Later that afternoon, the camp settled into a lazy rhythm. The danger had passed. The winter was coming. But for now, the sun was warm. Nora sat on a flat rock near the horse corral. In front of her sat 5 small children, their faces smudged with dirt, their eyes wide. Nora held a stick. She drew a vertical line in the red dirt, then 2 horizontal ones. "F," she said clearly. "F is for fire." "F," the children mimicked, giggling. "Fire," Nora repeated. "An F is for fort, an F is for freedom." A few yards away, Tahan was leaning against the fence, watching. His arm was in a sling, but he stood tall. He was supervising the older boys as they broke a new colt. He shouted instructions in Comanche, correcting their grip on the reins. He looked over at Nora. Their eyes met across the dusty corral. He did not smile, but his eyes crinkled at the corners. He nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture. "I see you," it said. "I see your worth." Nora nodded back. She turned to the children. "Now," she said, smoothing the dirt, "let us learn the letter H. H is for home." The sun began to dip, casting long, golden shadows across the prairie. The wind rustled the grass. whispering stories of the past and singing songs of the future. In the center of it all, a Boston spinster and a Comanche warrior went about the business of living, building a world that was strong enough to hold them both. The sun over the Texas Panhandle had not changed in 5 years. It was still a relentless, searing white eye that bleached the color from the wood and turned the red earth into iron-hard clay. But the world beneath it had shifted, not in the shifting of tectonic plates, but in the subtle, stubborn way that a river changes its course one stone at a time. It was the year 1880. The structure that stood near the bend of the Red River was made of rough-hewn timber and limestone, sturdy enough to withstand a tornado and large enough to hold a community. Above the wide double doors, a sign painted in neat, black letters swung in the breeze, Yazzie Pembroke Trading Post, fair goods, fair prices inside. The air was cool and smelled of coffee beans, cured leather, and dried sage. Nora stood behind the polished oak counter, her fingers flying over the keys of a new register. She was no longer the terrified woman in a gray wool traveling suit who had stepped off the train in Rio Santo. She wore a dress of blue calico, simple and practical, cut to allow for movement, with a beaded Comanche belt cinched at her waist. Her hair, once pulled back so tight it gave her headaches, was now braided in a thick, dark rope that hung over one shoulder, interwoven with strips of red ribbon. $3.50, Nora said, her voice clear and authoritative. The young corporal standing on the other side of the counter blinked. He was new to the frontier, fresh from a depot in Ohio, and he looked at Nora with a mixture of confusion and awe. "But ma'am," the corporal stammered, "in the town. A sack of flour is $5. "This is not the town, Corporal," Nora replied, not unkindly. "And we do not gouge the army any more than we gouge the people. The price is $3.50. Do you want it or not?" "Yes, ma'am," he said quickly, digging into his pocket for the coins. As he gathered his supplies, the door opened again. A group of 3 Comanche women entered, carrying bundles of tanned hides. They did not look down or hug the walls as they might have done in Rio Santo. They walked straight to the counter, chattering in their own tongue. Nora switched languages without a pause, greeting them in fluid Comanche. She inspected the hides, running her hands over the smooth leather, checking for tick bites or knife slips. She nodded her approval and pulled a jar of rock candy from the shelf, offering a piece to the toddler clinging to one of the women's skirts. The corporal watched, his mouth slightly agape. "You speak their language," he murmured. Nora looked at him, her blue eyes crinkling at the corners. "It is the language of my neighbors. Corporal, it would be rude not to—" She looked past him, out the open window, to the corral that lay between the post and the river. Tahan was there. He's 30 years old now. The boyish sharpness of his face had settled into the heavy, rugged handsomeness of a man in his prime. He wore a white cotton shirt, dusty from work, and leather leggings. He was inspecting the hooves of a Mustang, his movements slow and deliberate. His right arm, the one that had been shattered by Ezekiel Brandt's bullet, had healed, though it was slightly stiffer than the left. A jagged scar ran from his elbow to his wrist, a permanent map of that violent day. But he used the arm with confidence, lifting the horse's leg with gentle strength. He looked up, sensing her gaze across the distance. He did not wave. He simply locked eyes with her, a silent communication passing between them that was louder than any shout. "I am here. We are standing." A squeal of laughter broke the quiet afternoon. 2 children burst out of the barn, chasing a scruffy herding dog. The older one, a boy of 4 named Samuel, had Tahan's dark skin and black hair, but he had Nora's determined chin. The younger, a girl of 2 named Lark, was a blend of them both, with light brown skin and eyes that shifted between hazel and dark brown depending on the light. They ran through the dust, speaking a chaotic, joyous mix of English and Comanche, belonging everywhere and nowhere, the living embodiment of the bridge their parents had built. Tahan straightened up, wiping his brow. He scooped Lark up as she ran past, swinging her into the air until she shrieked with delight. He said something to the boy, pointing toward the river. Samuel nodded, running off to fetch water with a seriousness that mimicked his father. Nora felt a familiar ache in her chest, but it was not sorrow. It was a fullness so intense it almost hurt. This was the victory. It was not a victory won with a final battle or a treaty signing in Washington. It was won in the quiet moments in the flowers sold at a fair price, in the laughter of mixed-blood children who did not know they were supposed to be enemies, in the simple fact that they had survived. The door opened one more time that afternoon, bringing in a swirl of dust and a man Nora recognized. It was Dr. Reynolds from the fort, looking grayer and more tired than he had 5 years ago. "Good afternoon." "Nora," the doctor said, taking off his hat. "Tahan." Tahan had entered through the back door, wiping his hands on a rag. He nodded to the doctor. "Dr. Reynolds, you are far from your infirmary." "I had a call at the Miller homestead," the doctor explained. "Thought I would stop for coffee, and to bring you the mail." He placed a bundle of letters on the counter. Nora picked them up. There were invoices from suppliers in St. Louis, a letter from Clara in Fort Worth, who was now managing her own bakery, and a folded newspaper from Dallas. "There is news in the paper," Dr. Reynolds said quietly, accepting the cup of coffee Tahan poured for him. "Page 4. Nora unfolded the paper. The date was 2 weeks old. She scanned the columns until she found a small obituary tucked away near the bottom. Silas McGraw, former mayor of Rio Santo, died at age 62 in the state sanatorium. Cause of death listed as heart failure. Nora read the words twice. There was no mention of his crimes, no mention of the women he had sold, just a brief, sterile note about a man who had died alone and powerless. "He lost his mind at the end. They say," Dr. Reynolds murmured. "Keep shouting about contracts and weddings." Nora folded the paper calmly and set it aside. She felt no triumph, only a distant sense of closure. Silas McGraw was a ghost from a time that was fading. "And Brant?" Tahan asked, his voice level. "Gone," the doctor said. "Sold the last of his herd 6 months ago. The grazing restrictions choked him out. I heard he moved up to the Dakota Territory, trying to start over. But a man like that, he carries his misery with him?" Tahan nodded. He did not smile. He did not gloat. He simply took a sip of his coffee. "To the Comanche. The greatest punishment was not death. It was to be rendered irrelevant. Brant and McGraw had wanted to be kings of the border. Now, one was dead in an asylum and the other was a wanderer. The world moves on," Tahan said. "It does." The doctor agreed. "Thanks to people who push it." He finished his coffee and stood up. "I best be going. The colonel sends his regards. He says the new recruits could learn a thing or two about riding if you ever decide to teach a clinic. Tahan, tell the colonel I'm busy raising horses." Tahan replied, "And children." When the doctor left, the sun was beginning to dip low, painting the sky in the violent, beautiful purples and oranges that Nora had fallen in love with from a train window. She began to close up the post. She locked the cash register and wiped down the counter. Tahan barred the front door and turned the sign to closed. The silence of the evening settled over the room. The children were with Gray Willow in her lodge near the riverbank, listening to stories of the coyote and the spider. For a moment, it was just Nora and Tahan. He walked around the counter and stood behind her. He did not speak immediately. He simply wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his breath warm against her neck. Nora leaned into him, closing her eyes. She could feel the solid beat of his heart against her back. She covered his hands with hers, feeling the rough calluses and the scar on his arm. "Silas is dead," she whispered. "I know," Tahan said. His voice was a low rumble that vibrated through her. "Does it matter?" "No," Nora realized, opening her eyes. "It does not matter at all." She turned in his arms to face him. His face was lined by the sun and wind, and there were streaks of gray in his dark hair now. He looked tired, but it was the good tired of a man who has worked for himself and his family. "Let us walk," he said. They left the post and walked down toward the river. hand in hand. The grass brushed against their legs, dry and whispering. The river moved slowly, a ribbon of molten gold reflecting the sunset. They stopped at the water's edge, near the grove of cottonwood trees where they had first hidden from the world, where she had washed the dust of the train from her skin. Nora looked out at the horizon. It stretched forever, unbroken and free. "Do you remember?" Tahan asked softly. "Remember what?" "The square," he said. "The platform, the way you stood there, in that gray dress, looking like you wanted to set the world on fire with your eyes." Nora laughed, a soft, throaty sound. "I was terrified. Tahan, I thought my life was over. I stood there and listened to them bid on me like I was a lame horse. I thought I had traveled 2,000 miles just to be shackled." She turned to look at him. The dying light caught the planes of his face, turning his skin to bronze. "I looked at you," she continued, "and I saw the only man who did not look at me with greed, but I was still scared. I thought I was trading one kind of cage for another. I thought I would be a servant in a teepee instead of a servant in a ranch house." Tahan reached up and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture he had repeated 1,000 times in the last 5 years, but one that never lost its tenderness. "And now?" he asked. Nora looked at the trading post in the distance, then at the smoke rising from Gray Willow's lodge where their children played. She looked at the river that flowed without asking permission from any government. "Now," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I realized that I did not trade shackles. I traded a life that was written for me for a life I wrote myself. I thought I was losing everything on that auction block, heralded as a spinster, sold as a burden. But I traded the empty safety of Boston for the dangerous freedom of this river." She rested her hand on his chest. "I found my worth, Tahan, not because you gave it to me, but because you gave me the space to find it." Tahan covered her hand with his. His eyes were dark and serious, holding the weight of the years they had fought to be here. "And Tahan said, his voice rough, "I rode into that town thinking I was doing a duty. I thought I was saving a helpless woman to shame the white men who had no honor. I thought I would bring you to the camp, keep you safe, and perhaps send you back when the time was right." He stepped closer, eliminating the space between them. "I thought I was rescuing a stranger," he whispered, leaning his forehead against hers. "I did not know I was riding toward the other half of my soul. I found the person who would walk with me until the grass stops growing and the river stops flowing." He kissed her. It was not the desperate kiss of the night in the ravine, nor the hungry kiss of their first union. It was a slow, deep kiss of absolute belonging. It tasted of the evening cool, of coffee, and of the dust that was now part of their blood. As the sun finally slipped below the horizon, plunging the world into the velvet purple of twilight, they did not move. They stood together on the bank of the river. A Boston spinster who had become a matriarch and a Comanche warrior who had become a builder. The West was still wild. There were still dangers in the dark wolves, storms, and men with hate in their hearts. But in this small oasis, carved out by courage and held together by a contract written not in ink, but in trust, there was peace. Nora rested her head on Tahan's shoulder, watching the first stars appear. "I love you," she whispered into the silence. "I know," Tahan replied, his arm tightening around her. "You told me that the day you picked up the gun." "I never said it," Nora argued gently. "You did not have to." Tahan said, "You stayed." They turned and walked back toward the lights of the trading post, their shadows merging into one long shape on the grass. Behind them, the river flowed on, ancient and indifferent, carrying the story of the spinster and the warrior downstream, whispering it to the sea. Thank you, dear listener, for riding along on this journey with Nora and Tahan. It has been a long trail from the auction block in Rio Santo to the quiet peace of the riverbank, and I am truly grateful you chose to spend your time listening to their story. I would love to hear from you in the comments below. Where are you listening from today? Are you watching the sunset from a porch in Texas, or are you listening from a bustling city halfway across the world? Let's share our own stories. If this tale of the Wild West touched your heart, please consider subscribing to my channel, Wild West Tales. Give this video a like if you enjoyed the ride, and if you want to help these stories reach more ears, please hit that hype button. It helps more than you know to keep the campfire burning. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon